Chapter 1. Valentine. Weeks before arriving in Nevermore. We have to do something, because I can't pay this mortgage much longer. You said that you could find a job by now, I reminded Jake, a childhood friend who needed a place to stay in LA, and because his roomie kicked him out of their studio flat the size of a suitcase. I'd begged Jake to help me out. I'd impressed on him the seriousness of the matter, and I needed someone with me I knew who could keep me grounded after I'd broken up with my longtime manager. Well, my manager walked out on me and took everything. I glanced over at Jake, wedging into a pair of white shorts that appeared 2 sizes too small. He laid his back and ass on the bed, trying for an advantage, hoping to make them fit over a stomach he'd accumulated since he'd been in LA and eaten more pizzas than he'd realized. "Where did you see that?" I questioned, after he did manage to get them over his stomach, but his balls and shaft didn't make a pretty picture when he stood, as if he was proud of his accomplishment. On television and TikTok. Unlike Jake, I didn't have a free moment to watch new or old shows on Netflix, or peruse the insanity on TikTok. I heard it was all the rage for someone my age. 19 was supposed to be the year I could retire from modeling boys' and men's underwear. Sadly, I'll probably work until I'm dead. After working as a child actor since I was old enough to walk, I feel like an old man, I thought, looking at Jake, who appeared to be full of life, and he was all of 22. Jake turned and looked in the mirror, and then to me. "What do you think?" "I think you should burn those shorts." "What do you know?" he chided. "You've been protected too long. You need to get out. Why don't you come with me?" Maybe because I have too many things to worry about, I thought, and I wouldn't be any fun. Jake, however, lived to have fun, and the next drink and meal. After Jake appeared he'd given up trying to fit a round peg into a tight hole, he pulled his shorts down past his ankles, kicked them to the side, lay there for a few seconds before reaching for a pair of jeans that he'd thrown on the floor maybe a week ago, littering the already cluttered room with more clothes. It dawned on me just why his roommate had asked him to leave. "Do you really need that many clothes and shoes?" I asked as a plea. "Maybe a job to help me out with the rent." "I'll have you know that I didn't buy these things. I have this guy who I've dated off and on when I need a fresh change of clothes, and he works for this designer, and he offered me clothes to date him." I wasn't shocked by what Jake had said. I'd known him in high school when he'd always tried to get something for free, and he loved the attention of men. "You know there is nothing free, Jake. Everything costs." "Yeah, you're right. You're always right. How did you get so smart?" he questioned as he picked up a pair of jeans and smelled them, then threw them back on the floor. I was sure that was a rhetorical question, therefore I didn't take the time to answer him, and it would have done me no good if I had replied, because he'd find some reason to justify his lifestyle. Now, standing with a pair of jeans that passed the smell test, he dropped on the bed on top of a mound of clothes. Jake pranced in front of me, and I turned my head, because I wouldn't look at him in his briefs and bare chest. Jake needed to find a shirt, not a tee, because he rarely visited the gym, and he had these large nipples. I couldn't imagine how they got so large, and I didn't want to think about it, because when my eyes landed on them, Jake noticed and smiled. I quickly turned around, and he proceeded to explain how he'd broken up with a guy he really liked, because of a friend who'd offered him free clothing. That guy cost me the man I loved. I didn't have time to entertain Jake, because we'd be here all day, and I had to get to my lawyer's office to discuss a settlement with my partner/manager. Jake sat onto the bed, pulled off his briefs showing only his jockstrap, then he rose and traipsed over to the pile of clothes, bent like the exhibitionist I knew him to be, his round furry ass full of dark hair on display. I turned around to counteract his craving for attention. He wanted me to tell him how desirable he'd become, since he'd lost some weight. He knew it, and I knew he hadn't lost a pound. If he dropped weight, it was because I couldn't afford to buy food or go out to eat, and he had run out of men who would support his eating habits. The kind of food that was costly and cheap, and fast food Jake had been used to scoffing down by the truckloads. He needed a boyfriend who worked in a restaurant, and I believed that was who he was talking about when he said he had lost the man he loved. Jake moved from the closet to the floor in search of a clean tee. He bent and smelled it first, then it would land back in a pile of unwashed clothing. I stood with my back to him, wondering how long he'd stay in that position, since everywhere I looked there was a mirror. When I wouldn't indulge him in his fantasy that one day he'd convince me that he was the man for me, and we'd get together, because I'd wake up and notice how handsome he was, or I'd become so horny or drunk that we'd sleep together, and he'd be the pièce de résistance, and we'd be friends with benefits, and the benefit would be my contacts as well as the money he thought I had at my disposal. I didn't have the heart to tell Jake that I wasn't as smart as he thought, because I had done some stupid things too that would cost me dearly. That was how I knew that everything had a price, and I was about to pay the ultimate one. When he could no longer tempt me today, Jake's hands landed on a pair of black jeans he hadn't noticed before. This pair he'd selected appeared to be the only clean one in the bunch. After pulling them up and zipping, I let out a sigh of relief and turned to face him. He offered me a wide smile, sucked in his stomach, puffed out his chest, and said, "How do I look, Val?" Same question, different answer. Did you at least hear me? Were you listening? I glanced at his blank stare, and I could tell that everything I'd said had washed over him, unlike the jeans and shirts he'd been wearing. He rolled his eyes. I was listening to you, Val. I listened with my ears and not my eyes. I heard every word you said. Do you want me to repeat them? He questioned, his hand on his hips and turning around where I could comment on his attire. You look clean. You even lost a couple of pounds. One lie wouldn't destroy our friendship. The truth might. That's all you have to say? Maybe, wash those clothes before you go out on a date, so you could have something clean to look for a job. He twisted his mouth, turned to check his ass, and rolled his eyes once more, then he strolled closer to me, but I didn't have time for his shit. I was ready to get an early start to my lawyer and accountant's office, and learn my fate. I promise you tomorrow that I will have a job, and then I'll be able to contribute, but I have this guy who works at a coffee shop who gives me free coffee. As I was trying to control myself and walk away, Jake reached for my arm, and I turned to hear him out and remind him that things in LA weren't as permanent and lucrative for me as he believed it to be. It's not like you don't have the money, he continued to my dismay. You were the one who asked me to come out here to be with you. I had no intentions of going to LA. I was on my way to New York for a job. I turned to meet Jake's eyes with a raised eyebrow. And what were you going to do in New York? Get a job as a dancer, of course. I didn't know how that was possible, because he was all of 5'5", not very thin, and had never taken dance lessons in his life, even if you counted ballet lessons as a child, because his mother had wanted that, but his father thought it was a waste of money, and his father ranted that he'd done better by putting his talents to work, by feeding and caring for the farm animals. Jake had been looking for a way out, even as I'd returned to visit him each year that I'd been in LA, and that was since I was a child. When my father died of a heart attack in his 60s, and my mother left to live with her sister, I sold our farm, and gave all the money and more to my mother, and now I had to make another decision. Jake had red hair, and that may have been fine in LA as an extra on a movie set, which he'd done a few times when he wasn't fucking the extras, and he'd brought in a few bucks, but I wasn't certain about New York because of the sky-high rent, and Jake had never paid for anything, not even rent in his life. He didn't seem to be equipped for the real world, because there were no cowboys in LA or New York. But there were jobs for young men in the arts with talent and a name. I had been told that since I was a child actor and model, that I should go to New York, but I didn't listen. I wanted to stay in LA near my manager, who had been with me since I was a child. He'd come to our small rural town in Montana on a recruitment for a blonde child who could remember a few lines and had a bright, infectious smile. Well, that was me and my mother who needed money, and a man was taken in by him. She later discovered that he wasn't after a straight mother, but her gay son. To his credit, he never made a move on me until I turned 18, and boy was I blown away and smitten by him, which made me suspicious of men a certain age. That was because he came to me one day, said that I was broke, and we needed to move out of the home I'd bought and lived in most of my life. I'd called Jake, knowing that he wanted a way out of his farm life, hoping he'd help me keep my home by contributing to something, hopefully the mortgage, while I tried to secure more work. Jake came to LA with the promise that he'd get a job and help out, and now I couldn't afford this home I'd spent my childhood years working and paying for. Tonight had been the hottest night with all the fires in the canyon and one threatening my Malibu home, and I was in no mood for Jake's promises, and especially tonight. I'd been told earlier to sell the house, take the money, go to New York, and get a modeling job, which I thought I could do. My friend Jake glanced over at me as he and I were leaving at the same time. He placed his arm around my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Val, I'll come through for you. I have this thing I'm doing to make some fast money." I raised an eyebrow. "I'll have the money in no time." "I hope it's not something illegal, because if it is, I don't want it, and I don't want to see you and have to visit you in jail. You know they put gay men in solitary confinement to protect them." "Don't worry your pretty little head, Val. It's nothing like that. It's perfectly legal. You'll see, and I'll have money to help you." I swallowed a large breath. Reaching for my phone, I called an Uber, and in a few minutes I was at my lawyer's office. I left Jake climbing into a car going somewhere. Hopefully it was to a job interview. I could only wish, because he didn't look like he was dressed for anything that had to do with work. Maybe a restaurant gig. Maybe?